Hi, and welcome to this third episode now of Get Busy with Bradley Zink. Um, Today's episode will be discussing the canal system and speed rail system that I'm proposing to do along the border. But before we get into our show, I'd like to thank this episode's sponsor, the multi-award winning group, the Ronnie Lee Group, and the music that they provided for us for the beginning of the show from their latest single, uh, Prisoner. Thank you, Ronnie Lee Group, for sponsoring our show. Um, so today, like I said, we're going to discuss the in depth the speed rail system that I propose along the border, as well as a canal or aqueduct system to be able to bring both infrastructure as well as water and electricity out to the desert regions and the 200 miles of unused land that we have currently along the border that could be utilized for new city development. If we could start out with the current California speed rail pick there. Um, Currently, the state of California has, over several years, been trying to build out a speed rail system that would go from San Francisco to Los Angeles, basically going from one developed city to another developed city, hoping to reduce traffic as well as emissions by reducing the amount of necessary vehicles on the interstates. Um, the original price tag was going to be at $20 billion to complete this project. We're currently sitting at over $40 billion that's been spent on it without one section of it being completed yet. And now the estimates are topping out at over $100 billion when this project is finally completed, if it ever were to go to fruition and finally be completed. Next, if we could bring up the border pick, please. What I'm proposing is the 200 miles, as you see, from San Diego to Yuma, Arizona, is about 180 miles. So the project isn't even a whole 200 miles. So for a 180-mile project, where there's all of that land along the border due to lack of protection, safety concerns, what have lack of infrastructure currently. You have over 180 miles of unused land that could be developed, and in a time frame where California is desperately needing to meet the needs for both affordable and regular housing, not only now but in the distant future. San Diego County alone needs to come up with almost 180,000 houses in the next 6 years. With this 180 miles of undeveloped land, it would be a great opportunity and a great ability to lessen the amount of buildup and congestion in our cities by expanding eastward along the border there. Except if we could bring up the speed rail pick. So what I propose is, and in speaking with a couple of retired railroad engineers in Vista from the Steam Engine Museum, a tunnel system that goes theoretically from San Diego to Yuma, Arizona, about 70 to 80 feet below ground, enabling you to get from downtown San Diego to Yuma in an hour or less. Although with the current with the current fault lines that we have along the border traveling northward, there are two sections where the proposed tunnel would have to submerge and become above ground, and then go back underground after you've passed over the seismic areas in the southern portion of the state. Next, if we could bring up the light rail pick. By putting the below ground tunneling system for the speed rail, you'd be able to also eliminate any illegal trafficking underneath and tunneling underneath the border. Now, above ground, just above this same speed rail project, you put a light rail project. If we could put up the light rail pick, if it's available, please. Thank you. That's the light rail pick, not the California speed rail pick. Anyway, if we could, what we would do is put a light rail system above ground, that 180-mile section, which would also along the border, which would also prevent any illegal trafficking across the border above ground, thus making that 180 miles of current unused land there along the border safer to be able to use for development for in excess of probably 3 million homes. You'd be creating new cities, which would bring about millions of new jobs, both in the private sector and in unionized labor sector, as well as reducing the constant mandates on the cities and counties for maxing out the usable land and using up every single square inch of land that we have in our cities today, which is causing the traffic congestions that we have. Now, in doing a project like this, there's always the costs associated with it. How would that project be funded? So, as far as the tunneling system goes, Elon Musk's boring company charges $10 million per mile of tunneling. As stated, it's about a 180-mile project where it would come above ground, about 30-mile segments. So it'd be about a total of 150 miles of tunneling needed, which would be a cost of about $1.5 billion. To be able, in the current situation with building the tracks, it costs roughly $100 to $150 or $1 million per mile of track, both for the speed rail and for the light rail system. Again, it would be about 150 to 180 mile project. In adding up all of those totals, to do about 150 mile segment of both speed rail and light rail, it would cost roughly 20 to 30 billion dollars, which comes in at 20% of what the state's proposed total cost for the San Francisco to LA speed rail system would cost alone. In this one, you're able to get two rail systems, a speed rail and a light rail, and shore up the border to enable the development and growth of new cities, millions of new homes at all affordable levels of income for purchasing those homes. Other benefits that you'd be able to get from this project, if we could bring up the solar panel pic, please. When you're building in high density cities, you're required by federal law to have walls built up to protect both the trains and people from the tracks and from each other, from getting injuries and death. When you build those walls, you could line the tops of those walls with solar paneling systems, as you see here. That would be an extra added measure of security for trying to climb over the walls, as well as bringing in a source of power for the new communities that we'd be developing. Another source of power, if we could bring up the turbine pic, please. In speed rail systems, what they develop is a wind turbine power collecting system, whereas the speed rail is rushing down the tracks in excess of 200, 300, 400 miles per hour. A series of turbines would be spun, much like your wind power sources that you see today. And with the segments that we'd be building up of this speed rail system, a speed rail would be going by here every 20 minutes in each of the two segments, both one going eastbound, one going westbound, thus creating additional power sources that we'd be able to use to take a burden off the power grids that would be created for building these new cities and new communities. Additional benefits for having this light rail and speed rail system in the building and development of these communities is you would have the much needed land for corporate development. You can even have corporate offices relocating or even opening up secondary offices along the border in Southern California, bringing in more tax dollars. You would be able to, as I mentioned, greatly reduce the amount of traffic and congestion in our cities now. And then, as I had mentioned in our, or discussed in my last episode on the homeless issue, um, you'd be building these tiny home communities along the area of the where the railroad tracks are, um, thus giving, which would also solve the homeless problems that we have today, by moving them out of the cities and the tent communities and into established tiny home communities. Um, that about sums it up for my proposal for the speed and light rail system. Next, I'd like to address my proposal for building a canal or a aqueduct system, if you would, similar to the one that we have going from Northern California to Southern California, bringing water for both agriculture and residential and commercial use. As you can see, this is our current aqueduct system that we're using today. What I propose is building from, you know, one of the things that we have to deal with is global warming and the climate, the changing climate, is the rising sea levels. Also, the dwindling snowpack that we have year after year here in California, meaning less and less water to go around to be divided up for where it's needed. Um, Take agriculture, for instance. Almonds, everybody loves to eat almonds. But most people probably don't realize that it takes a gallon of water just to produce one almond. So you can see that just in a can of almonds, you got 200, easily 200 almonds. That's 200 gallons of water just to produce one can of almonds. And that's just one industry of agriculture that has a need for water, not to mention 40 million Californians that need drinking water. So in building a canal or aqueduct system from the Pacific Ocean around the Imperial Beach area, building it along that 180-mile stretch of the border that I had mentioned, you would be able to address the issues with the rising sea levels. And then along the way of this 180-mile path of the aqueduct, you'd be putting in, if we could bring up the desalination pic, please, you'd be putting in a series of 2 or 3 desalination plants. That would help to address the needs for fresh drinking water. One of the major problems with desalination is the dumping of the salt back into the ocean, causing a large concentration of salt in and around the desalination plants. By now creating an aqueduct and putting these every 50, 60 miles along the border there, one with the length, each segment that they would be traveling at 50 or 60 miles each, the water would start to become slightly brackish. So once they got to each of the desalination plants, you would actually have less strain on the system, being able to produce more gallons of drinking water per day. Take, for example, the Carlsbad desalination plant we have right now produces about 50,000 gallons of drinking water per day, or about 7% of the water needed used in the county of San Diego. And it's built right there along on the coast. The desalination plants that I propose building along this 180-mile aqueduct system would in turn be brackish, less, it'd be more brackish water, less concentration of salt as it's traveling that distance, thus being able to accommodate anywhere from 50 to 75,000 gallons of fresh drinking water per day production. And then it'd be increased greatly every 50 miles as you down the line as you're producing these desalination plants. Now, if we could bring up the hydroelectric plant pic, please. Also, we'd be putting in a series of hydroelectric power plants, which will do two things. One, help to push that water, the 50-mile stretch down the line that we would need for each of these segments, as well as creating thousands of gigawatts of electricity that would be needed in these new cities and communities that we would be developing along the border. Excuse me. Now, some of the cost associated with building out these different projects. The Carlsbad desalination plant came in at a cost of $1 billion. So just to install 3 of these desalination plants along the 180-mile stretch would only be a budget of about $3 billion to produce. The hydroelectric power dams cost roughly about $2.5 billion each. The canal system, like I said, it's 180 miles from Imperial Beach to Yuma, Arizona. From Imperial Beach to El Centro, California is a 120-mile stretch. Then to continue on from El Centro, California to Yuma, Arizona would be another 60 miles. Now, the reason why I bring up El Centro, California is because due north of El Centro, California is the Salton Sea. The Salton Sea, which was once, was once a thriving community, over the last 30, 40 years has become very unpopulated, very toxic because of the diminishing sea level and the toxicity that's been left behind in the sediment, as well as creating a larger amount of dust, which causes asthma cases, a lot of upper respiratory issues, and as well as driving people out of the community of living there. But one of the keys to the Salton Sea is the projected over $7 billion lithium deposit that lies 8,000 feet below the Salton Sea. Lithium has become more and more important in today's society with the popularity of electric cars. There's currently 2 companies that are building mining operations out at the Salton Sea now to tap into that over $7 billion lithium deposit, which will bring several thousands of jobs to the community and help develop that and help bring back their economic prosperity, as well as where they're putting the facilities will be covering the land that is too toxic to build on for, say, residential housing. The company Metcalf and Eddy, a Massachusetts-based firm with almost a century of experience in large-scale water resource management, has proposed building 2 canals, the largest of which would be navigable for ocean-going vessels from just south of the border in Mexico up to the Salton Sea. The cost for digging the U.S. portion, which is a 70-mile length, for digging the 2 canal systems would cost an estimated $300 million, and a final price tag on the entire project going from the Salton Sea into Mexico would be estimated at about, what do we have here? It was estimated to come in at $2.5 billion, capped out at roughly $3 billion. What this is can be used for is a basis for how much my proposal of doing a canal or aqueduct system from Imperial Beach to Yuma, Arizona at 180 miles would cost. My approach wouldn't have to utilize a canal system deep enough to be able to handle ocean-going vessels, although that is a very interesting proposal, because in building it up with deep enough to be able to handle ocean cargo transit, it brings, the local governments stand to gain um, a large amount of money in both the revenue and land and commerce taxes, as well as offering an additional um, shipping port areas similar to what we have in Long Beach, thus creating less congestion and less demand on unloading cargo in Long Beach. Um, Using their approach of it would cost $3 billion for a 2 canal system of 70 miles, then we can just estimate that my project for 120 miles going from Imperial Beach to El Centro, and then an additional 70 miles going from El Centro up into the Salton Sea to bring additional salt water back to the sea as well. The Salton Sea, increasing the water level and lessening the amount of civilization that it already has in it, thus causing all the wildlife to diminish there. Um, the total project for the canal from Imperial Beach to the Salton Sea into El Centro, California would cost about 10 roughly 10 to 15 billion. To continue it all the way to Yuma, Arizona, we could have a 2 canal system large enough for ocean vessels, mind you, bringing water to the desalination of hydroelectric power plants for a total of $20 billion. So between just the two projects of that I propose along the border there, of both a canal or aqueduct system, as well as a light rail and speed rail system, protecting the border, enabling development of over 180 miles of undeveloped land to handle the millions of homes that we will need to build for both currently today and the few 20, 30 years of population growth for the state of California could be handled by these millions of new homes and new cities being developed. The economic impact, remember, California being the fifth largest GDP in the world, would bring in tens of billions of dollars of additional revenue. The state would own these projects, which would be revenue generating projects. It would come in less than the projection of just doing the simple speed rail system from San Francisco to Los Angeles, thus saving the taxpayers billions of dollars over the next 10 years trying to build these projects. But nobody wants additional taxes. So the wonderful thing about the time that we're in today is, with federal government passing last year the $1.3 trillion infrastructure bill, with California set to receive somewhere between 45 to 60 billion dollars of that 1.3 trillion for infrastructure upgrades and development. The money that we get from the federal government from the infrastructure bill alone would be able to cover the cost that would be associated with building both the canal or aqueduct system along the US-Mexico border, as well as building the speed and light rail system along the US-Mexico border, and costing the taxpayers zero in additional taxes. Rarely do you hear your political candidates ever proposing revenue generating ideas that lessens the amount of taxes that would need to be collected from Californians, or from anybody in the US in that matter. California, as I said, the fifth largest GDP in the world, their number one source of revenue for our GDP is personal income tax. It comes in roughly about, I believe, $178 billion a year in personal income tax. So when you hear candidates say that they're going to do away with personal income tax in the state of California, that would never happen. The state would never remove its largest source of revenue, as well as the fact that the governor um, does not have the authority to be able to do away with your personal income taxes. But my project isn't adding taxes, it's adding revenue generation for the state. It's adding both um, electrical and water needs that our state desperately needs to address, not only now, but in the future. Um, we're at 40 million people roughly in the state of California. Projections put us possibly 45 to 50 million people by 2035. The current state's approach is putting mandates on cities to handle these population increases, and then trying to find ways to fit in to those set numbers of houses that you have to build: affordable housing, low-income housing, residential housing, commercial real estate development, building in high flood and high wildfire areas, thus causing the taxpayers to have higher insurance just to be able to own or rent their properties to begin with. In building up this infrastructure, and we already have an interstate that runs from here to Yuma, Arizona, the 8, so you don't have to build an additional mega uh, interstate. It makes logical sense, financial sense, and addresses the needs that we need of both our population growth, our demand, our increased demand of water and electricity, and the current situation of the dwindling natural resources we have for that, as well as building up the Salton Sea, like I said, um, that has billions of dollars of lithium that is very important to the electric car industry and companies like Tesla that would benefit greatly from being able to open up one of those gigafactories, instead of losing that revenue to Texas like they did it for their latest factory that they built, or the one in China or Germany. Um, we had that 180 miles of land that we could be using for purposes just like that as well, bringing in additional billions of dollars in tax revenue on corporations and not on the tax-paying population in 40 million Californians that are already taxed enough as it is. Well, I think that about wraps it up for today's episode of Get Busy with Bradley Zink. Um, I again like to thank the Ronnie Lee Group for being today's sponsor for our show and for providing the music from their newest single, Prisoner. I'd like to also just briefly mention that our next episode, we are going to be tackling one of the larger issues in California as well, the public education system in California. California currently ranks 36th in the nation in per student spending, 41st in the nation in commitment to education funding. I'm going to address the issues that we have with our current public school system and my proposed solutions to increase in the funding without generating new taxes on California people today. Thank you all for tuning in to today's episode. I look forward to seeing you all on our next episode. Have a wonderful day.